For the most part, the greatest job that most women had was to be a mom and to stay home, wearing an apron and always having bright lipstick on and great meals for their family and clean house. If they did anything, it was, volunteering in the school classroom for their kids, or maybe they would have like their friends over for tea and crimpets. Yeah, that was kind of what I remember my mom just having like church ladies over, and she stayed home until I was in first grade, and then she went to work full time. And I remember as, a 6-year-old being very angry because none of my friends' moms worked. And so I didn't think that she should work either outside the home. I also remember one of my teachers was a woman, and she was pregnant and told us that after she had her baby, she wasn't going to work anymore. And I remember really thinking about that, like, well, she's a great teacher, so why wouldn't she keep working after she had her baby? And then on women that were nurses. And so I thought that's what I wanted to be when I grew up, because that's pretty much what I saw women doing was nursing. So it just didn't seem like there were a lot of different options to work outside of the home. So that was kind of my observations. I remember in my physical education class that the teacher would always comment on how the boys were so much better and more athletic. And, the girls always got picked last, like we'd have to pick teams. And he would always talk about, well, you have to pick a girl because we have to try to be fair. And so girls were definitely put down, that we did not have the kind of athletic abilities that our boy classmates had. So I did not think that was, it bothered me, but I guess I didn't really think that it was that horrible, just because that's what I heard all the time. And most of the professional sports were also men. That's what we watched. So it wasn't really very often that girls were as involved in athletics. So I also remember a math teacher who would always talk about how boys, you better watch out because the girls are getting better at math and they're going to take your jobs. So it was like very, protective of male jobs, or that were mostly men at the time. So engineers and those that were strong in math. So those are two things I remember, and that were kind of shaming women or girls, but maybe they weren't that intentionally doing it. So it didn't seem like it was such a bad thing.
Yeah, so it's more internalized, I guess.
Yeah.
Teacher saying that.
Yeah, I remember thinking that when it was time to run for like student government positions, and I had a friend who wanted to be the treasurer, and she was a she. And I remember thinking that was like courageous of her, because most of the student government were the guys in our classes. So this was in junior high. And I remember thinking when she won that, that was just an amazing thing, that she defied the odds and was going to be a student government representative. I think my parents were probably ahead of the curve as far as like my mom going to work full time. I remember her telling me that even though I didn't like it, that sometimes, you want to do more than be home and be a mom, and that you could do both things. So I don't remember. I think they were more advanced. My grandmother lived with us, and she thought, this was terrible. So, I mean, she definitely bought into the whole stereotype that a woman shouldn't work outside the home. So I do remember her kind of giving me extra attention, because she thought, she pitied me that, I was home alone because my siblings were a lot older than me. So she lived in an apartment above us. And so she would always have me come up when I got home from school and have tea and stuff, cookies with her. So I think I, was challenged by the fact that I wanted my mom around more, but also as I got older, thinking this was a good thing that she was working outside the house. So I think I had a lot of support that the stereotype of only men working needed to be changed. Well, I think as I started to consider my own like college major, what I wanted um, to study, I knew that if I was going to go to college, I wanted it to be more than just to find a husband. Like that was the joke, that you would go get your MRS degree. And I had a lot of friends that's what they were going to college for. Um, so I do remember thinking that I needed to major in something that I would be able to get a job. And, a lot of women like majored in home economics so that they'd be good at running a household, but I wanted to do something that would be different than that. So I just, the tension of, I knew that I wanted to have a career, but I also wanted to have a family. So I was trying to figure out, what would be a life vocation that I could do both things and do them well, and more importantly, enjoy them. So all of those things were in my mind as I was trying to discern what would be a career for me.
Uh, Stories or reactions that they gave you?
Well, my best friend, her name was Donna, and I used to spend a lot of time at her house. And I remember in college when I had decided to major in history and religion with hopes of going to seminary, and her dad telling me that, women could not be clergy. Like all a woman could do was to be a nun, and they had a Catholic, background. And so he kept calling me nun Trisha. Nun Stewart was my maiden name. And so I remember, he was trying to tease me, but he really believed that it was a dumb thing to major in that, because I wasn't going to be able to get a job unless I wanted to be a nun, which I told him I did not want to be a nun. So I did remember them teasing me. I remember when I was interviewing at a seminary to be accepted to that school, and I remember the dean telling me that I was too young to go to seminary, which most of the seminary students were men who were coming right out of college. So that made no sense to me because we were the same age. So it was his way of trying to keep me out by saying that I was too young, when really what he was saying was I was too female. So those were two early on reactions that I remember. No, well, I remember by the time I was ordained, when I had my ordination, I invited all of my relatives to come. And I had an aunt, Carol, who said she came through the line and gave me a hug, and she said, "I'm happy for you, but I don't agree that this is right. Like, I don't think you should be a pastor, and you should not be an authority over men." Like, that was a huge issue for her, was that only men should preach to both, to the congregation, and that women should only teach children. And her husband, who was my mom's brother, was right behind her, and he just very directly said, "I don't agree with her, and I wholeheartedly support you." So kind of right there in that marriage, there was an example of how some people were very supportive and others were not. So by the time I was ordained, that was 1992. So things were opening up a little bit more. I remember one that was pretty recent was a young man was talking to his mom about how much she appreciated having me as his pastor. And he asked her if when he grew up, if he could be a pastor. And she said, "Well, sure." And he said, "Well, I didn't know that boys or men could be pastors. So it was just interesting that because I was, his model of a pastor, that he thought only women were pastors. So that kind of made me laugh. Very different. And I think I've heard a lot, both men and women, who have said how refreshing it is to have a woman's perspective as a pastor, preaching and baptizing babies or, children, people, also weddings, funerals, like having a very nurturing, personal style. And not to say that a man would necessarily not have that, but it's probably more likely that women have a little more maternal approach of just kind of that life is a story that needs a lot of encouragement, that people in their journey need that kind of love and compassion, and women bring a different perspective to ministry. So I've heard people comment about that. And I think also have had young women who have been in the youth groups that I have led and over the years that have said, how much they appreciated having a woman to talk to about life and their relationship with God that was different from when they had a male pastor. There's been a few days, yes, I think. Mostly because that we live in a society in America and many places in the world where, the church is a low priority for people or their spiritual life. They don't really care or they don't have one. And so, it used to be that going to church and being part of a faith community was much more common in our country. And now it's, less than 50% was the recent study of Americans, that go to church. So it's harder to have an active congregation with people, and there's just so many more things that compete for people's time. So that becomes draining because you're always trying to compete with, sports and all the different leisure activities that are out there. And then now with the pandemic, people are just another reason not to go to church because they're scared of whatever with the virus or the new variants. And so you're always having to kind of dig deep to try to come up with things to engage with people. So that makes me struggle. I don't know if you use the word regret. What word did you use? Did you say?
Regret and not think of
Yeah.
struggle,
So
decision.
I don't know that I regret the decision to be a pastor, but I think I struggle with how it's become less of a part of people's life. So I don't think I would choose a different vocation because it's so meaningful. And it has given me a lot of flexibility over the years that I've been able to travel. And I could also go to Hope's Valentine party at elementary school if I needed to be the mom in charge of the party. And, I had a lot more flexibility with my schedule because I can work morning, noon, and night. So if I need to take the afternoon off, I'm able to do that.
Right.
Yeah, I think I've had, one of my earliest stories was the first funeral that I did. I went to the funeral home and went over to the widow to comfort her and let her know I was there, that it was, almost time to start the funeral. And the funeral director came over and told the widow that when the pastor arrived, we would have prayer and we would start the service. And so I let him know that I was the pastor. And he looked at me from head to toe a couple times, kind of checking me out, and said, "You cute little thing, you're the pastor," as if, it was just very demeaning and sexist. So that was kind of a rough start. And I've had people not include me in an interview process because they felt that the church would be better suited to have a male pastor. So, that was kind of a blatant, we don't want a woman, or we don't think a woman should be the head pastor. You can be an associate, second in command, but not the head pastor. And then sometimes people will kind of say things about my hair or what I'm wearing that I don't think they would comment to a man. Um, well, I think that I would really hope that congregations wouldn't look at whether or not, the applicant for the job was a man or a woman, but is this the right person that God is calling to lead our congregation? So there would be more a sense of really looking at the person's gifts and abilities rather than trying to figure out, well, how is the congregation going to accept this person because she's a she? And maybe the church has never had, women in leadership before in a ordained position. There are some churches that don't have women even take the offering, and it's kind of all the different parts of society, it's really so far behind. Um, so I think that's really my hope, is that more and more women would feel called and courageous, and that, down the road, it wouldn't even be a question that you could have a female clergy person. Yeah, it tends to depend on if it's like an urban area. So, um, Atlanta, you would have a much better opportunity as a woman clergy than you would out in rural Georgia or northern Florida. Just it kind of depends on the area that you live in. But I know I don't. You could look it up. I haven't looked recently, but I know the percentage of women clergy. I think it's still like 3-1 men to woman. So, but I think the percentage has gone up. So I think that, yeah, there are places still in America that don't have women. It depends on what denomination they are as well. Um,
Thank you so much for helping me take it through. I know that it did take a bite out of schedule and all stuff. Happy people. Yeah. First off, can I ask you about all the so growing up, I'm sorry, growing up, can you tell me about all the stereotypes you have faced about girls and like the negative stereotypes that have been dumped on or about girls in the workforce or in male dominated fields? So that was that more of a cultural norm for you, or were you kind of personally affected by those stereotypes?
I think all women are personally affected in greater or lesser ways. I grew up in an open environment with my family, thankfully. So it didn't affect me as greatly, except that there were expected careers for women, teaching, nursing. I remember my mom thinking, though, that I should go into computers and that would be a good business move. That was not my path. So spiritual things were always my interest and my passion. And most of the pastors that I saw were mixed. So that affects you because you have a hard time envisioning yourself in those roles when you only see males in those kind of situations. So yeah, sure, it does affect.
So growing up, you grew up with both parents. You grew up in public school, seeing those stereotypes in a day-to-day basis with your siblings at school. Do you have any memories of seeing those actions and not seeing those stereotypes be played out or used as an insult to you or your other female friends in school as a kid?
As an insult or used against me. as a child, questions as a younger person.
Yeah, and like when you're on the playground at recess, you want to play football, but guys are like, oh, girls can't play football. Do you have any memories of that?
Not in a sports context, but in the very culturally biased ways that girls are expected to be in the kitchen, helping their mom, while my brothers were working more with their hands, and doing physical things and being in sports. I was nurtured in music, and it affected me positively. So the things that I later gravitated to were nurtured, and I was allowed, where I was fortunate was I was allowed to investigate whatever I wanted because of my parents, who they were. But there were definite traditional roles that were expected of women and mothers, and roles expected of my brothers that were different from mine. I was the first of our family to graduate from college. So that was a significant event. Neither of my older two brothers graduated. They both went into the military and in Vietnam. So when I chose the path of education and higher education later, that was a very proud moment for my family, but it was also very new that the youngest daughter, my two brothers were older than me, so the youngest daughter would end up being, the most educated by standards, by normal standards. So that I wasn't held back from. But there were clear distinctions about what a mother should do when I was married and had children. Children first, before everything else. That was just a built-in stereotype, like you said, for a culturally conditioned norm. That yes, I was raised.
So growing up with stereotypes and how you have felt about them, did you ever ask as a parent or a teacher, why are these negative stereotypes about girls that kind of makes them seem lesser or more inferior to males, or they're being held back from, or are girls being held back from a field that's male only? And did you ever question why that may be?
When I was younger, when I was a child and in junior high and high school, I did not challenge the status quo at that time, but I did later. So that may be another question another time. But I definitely stood up and challenged, and continue to this day to challenge those expectations and beliefs that are limiting.
What got you into ministry as a child? Was it music, being in a church choir as a kid, or was it just something about Christianity or the Bible or your personal experience being a Christian or being raised in your church as a child?
So, as a pastor, I began in music ministry, but I was ordained 15 years ago. So, always from a very early age, I knew that I had a deep passion for things of faith and spirituality. And because I was raised in the church, and because I watched the church, and I had diverse experiences in other faiths, as well as our Christian faith, and experiences in other denominations besides our Baptist denomination, that really was encouraging to me. The biggest thing for me was my seminary experience in a very open and affirming and welcoming seminary. So a lot of the growth that I experienced as a woman came through that seminary experience. And later my experience in community development. When I served on the school board, our local school board, that was a pivotal learning experience about the realities of girls versus boys educational experience. For instance, how often boys are called in a classroom in contrast to how often girls are called. You know, how often boys are channeled into STEM, you know, and math, and how often girls are channeled into other more appropriate. So when I began to learn the research and see the realities of that, that changed me and formed me and informed me. It informed me, and I became more of an activist, and it became clear to me. And there were some reasons why. I think it's personal.
Also, I wanted to ask you, when you made your decision to pursue your chosen career as a pastor or as a minister in a church, did you know that the negative experiences you may face, negative sexism that did resonate in several churches or church as a whole?
I did. Because I was a second career, non-traditional student going into, first I was a musician. And frankly, when I was a musician, everybody was talking about girls should be music, you know, girls can be music. There isn't much of a cultural expectation that only guys can be musicians, you know. Girls can be musicians. So there was no real problem with that. But when I became a pastor, that was where I began to know this stuff. Well, we would like you to stay as a musician. Just to be a musician. Why do you want to be a pastor? Right? And I began to know, and later in the years, I came to work for our denomination. And one of my main jobs was helping churches find pastors. And what I ran up against was the number of churches who would not entertain applications from women. So there's still a very high glass ceiling for women in ministry. Women in ministry are often associate pastors, great, we'll hire a Christian education director, or we'll hire a musician, or we'll hire an associate pastor. But to be a senior pastor, it's very difficult. It's getting better. I'm going to say that the hope is it's getting better. And there are more women. But a lot of that is because there's fewer pastors and it's harder to find men, sadly. So they have to entertain applications from women. But that is one very real reality, is that many churches are still not open to women in ministry. Many are. You know, when I say that many is not a concrete research. So yes, the other thing, hope, is that there's a differential in salaries between pastors, male pastors, and female pastors. And I have run up against that. Absolutely. Well, your husband, you know, how many times have I heard, well, your husband works. You don't need that much money. Your husband has a job. Shouldn't even be a factor. Shouldn't even be mentioned, you know. It's great, and I'm fortunate that I have a good job, but it has nothing to do with fair and equitable pay for me and my job. So that is still a reality in many places.
All right. Also, I wanted to ask, do you have any memories of challenging the status quo or any negative reactions from the coworkers or the boss when you did kind of step up and try to say, hey, why are you kind of being prejudiced against female pastors?
Yeah, I did. In a previous position, I felt some real resistance when I was ordained and was ready to move into an ordained position. That was, again, kind of what I alluded to. That it was great when I was doing what they expected me to do and what fit with their picture of what I should be doing. But when I became pastor, things changed. So I was challenged by some some other power players in the church. And some of it was really also a reluctance, I think, of people to understand that women have goals and women have visions, and they also aspire to higher education. So sometimes you run up against, it wasn't, I don't know if that was, I was going to say, I don't know if that was so much a gender inequity or if it was, again, something to do with pay and women's roles and being in a home or staying in a place. But there was I was astounded at the amount of men who questioned why I was the one with a master's degree and my career is in master's divinity. And why would I do that? What I did. And I knew why, because I felt deeply called to continue and to pursue and strive and to reach for becoming all that I could be. So yeah, there were times where people were like, just didn't get it. How'd you do that? No, you're not going to get money. No, you're not going to get hired. I was fortunate to get hired as a senior minister, but that's not very often.
So, despite the harsh stereotypes you may have faced from your superiors or your peers, would you say that your career has more positive results than negative results?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Even with the challenges.
Okay. Have you ever been in a time where you've had a negative reaction with another pastor, with someone in your church, and you it almost made you regret taking that choice, like becoming a pastor or being involved in your church?
No, I have never regretted the decision and the follow-up to that decision. Even when challenge existed. The joys of being in this role are so great that they override real, and I would want women to know that. And it is changing for the better. So I think that's the aspect about the whole thing. I have never regretted it. Have I? I mean, this is a joke. I don't know how you ever put this in because it sounds materialistic, and I don't. But even when the money is crap, I have never regretted it. But hope, what if I was single? I have a responsibility for other women. And so, yeah, I am in a privileged position because I am married and I'm not reliant on my sole salary. But it's difficult for women who have to rely on their salary to support themselves and to make sure that those salaries are fair and equitable would be a dream, a hope, and a position that I would want to continue to advocate. Take your time. Ask me to say it again, slow down at the back. No rush.
Sorry.
What?
You can pick up my train.
Another bias that I have noticed is in committee meetings or in working in groups that are heavily male-oriented groups. I have noticed a tendency that if men speak in a group, they tend to be listened to more, and you know that because I feel it because of the way people, the way other men react to them and agree with them, and I have felt at times like I'm not heard, or my opinion is not respected, and that gets old.
I would expect that. I had that actually too. A lot of it's not in the pastoral, but that's just at school too. So.
Yeah. I don't think it's specific to any profession, really. I think it's
Culture.
Yeah.
Okay, also, lastly, to end, I wanted to ask you, what is one thing you would wish for a change? What change do you wish for the future female pastors or any female in any respectable, really high
career field that's typically not mainly male fields.
So, in particular to my profession, I definitely would like to see women considered for more senior pastor and upper level ministry roles, and not only associate roles or other kinds of part-time roles. I'd like to see women considered for full-time, equitable, same salary roles as what men consider. Well, that's for sure. I'd like to see women breaking the glass ceiling for those kind of professions, and all professions where women are limited or locked down, intentionally or unintentionally. I would like to still like to see that. But that answer, I can say it again and see if I got off track. Didn't answer it well.
Okay, so I ask you, what is one change you wish for the future for females in general, mainly in religious settings or in male-dominated fields? You told. Okay, I'll let you speak that.
For it. Yeah, I'd also like to be able to see practices for families and women that allow for women to be able to have balanced lives with families and children. So, child care, maternity leave, those kinds of advocacies for the kind and paid health and family leave.
So that is powerful. Yeah. And that's all I have. Thank you for me.
No problem.
The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul. He guides me in paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Even though I walk in the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff remind me. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil, and my cup overflows. Surely goodness and mercy will follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever.
All right. So Amy, can you tell me growing up in like the 70s and the 80s, what were the stereotypes you faced as a girl, as a little kid, from your family, from your classmates, from teachers, just from people you knew as a kid?
I think that growing up, I probably grew up with so many stereotypes that I wasn't really aware that I was growing up with them. In hindsight, stereotypes like women should be mothers is one. Stereotypes of that said things like girls and women should be nice was probably one that sunk in pretty hard when I was growing up. Yeah, and I think that a lot of that also was built into roles that I saw women play. There wasn't a lot of I guess, is that enough, Hope? Does that kind of answer some of your questions?
Yes. Did you have any personal experiences of those stereotypes being forced on you? Like, you're at recess, you want to play football, but a kid tells you girls can't play football. Did you ever experience that on a personal level?
I have to admit, I really didn't.
Do you think that when you grew up in high school or college and you kind of became aware of all the stereotypes that kind of set women different apart from men, that kind of helped you influence your beliefs or your personality when you were my age, like 19, going to college, it kind of influenced on what path you chose to go to in life?
Absolutely. Absolutely it did, Hope. And you named the time just perfectly. It really was in college that I became more aware of stereotypes and even became aware really in college that ministry could be a possibility for me. I had never seen a woman preach until I was in college. And so I am a person who maybe you've heard it said that and people say it more and more nowadays, until you see yourself represented in a role, it's very difficult for you to imagine yourself in that role. And I had never seen a woman as a preacher or pastor until I was, I guess 19 or 20.
Right.
Yeah. And so, and even growing up, Hope, this is the story that I was kind of talking about specific to the church of example of that. I never went against the tide. I remember having a very powerful experience in third grade at a church camp. And I didn't know, I was so young, I didn't know what was going on. I didn't know if it was emotions or the Holy Spirit, or I didn't know what. And I went to a very wonderful, loving Sunday school teacher and said, I don't know what's happening. I don't know why I feel the way I feel. And her response was, well, honey, maybe you're being called to be a missionary or a pastor's wife. And so even in conversations in my church growing up, she didn't say, maybe you're called to be a pastor. Like, those were the two options. Maybe you're called to be a missionary or a pastor's wife. And so, so in high school and college, I started talking with people and being introduced to people and being engaged in ministry with leaders who started saying, you could do this and you have gifts for it. And look at all these other women who have done it.
When you made that decision to become a pastor or to go into Christian ministry as a woman, were you aware of the hardships or the sexism you may face during your career?
I was aware of it. And I knew the history of difficulty that women faced in ministry. But I would think I was a little naive about the idea that how do I say this? When I went into ministry, I think my idea of sexism was very simplistic, in that I thought, if you are sexist, you are not going to allow me to be in ministry. And if you are not sexist, then you will allow me. So it was a very naive and simplistic understanding of, you're either going to let me do this or you're not. And so since I've been in the ministry, I have come to know very deeply that is not the case. That just because you are allowed to be in ministry, and my goodness, just because someone says I'm supportive of women in ministry, doesn't mean that same person is not going to be sexist and treat you in a sexist way. Yeah. So I would say, Hope, that I was aware of the difficulty, but I was naive about how deeply embedded it is.
All right. And going off of that question, do you have any memories or negative experiences in your career because of the embedded sexism that some people may have not even realized that was so internalized in them or in that church you work with?
Yes. All the time. I could tell you stories from, yes, all the time, Hope. How much time do you have?
I think this meeting's only going to be an hour long, so let's take one story. So
sure. I'll tell you a few. They're short. How about? I've gone to visit a church member in the hospital, And they and I was there with my Bible in a professional capacity, and the church member from the hospital bed turned to the doctor and said, "Look, this is my girlfriend." I have had men hug me and kiss me without asking permission. I've had a person come in off the street, come to my office looking for assistance, who's hungry, and encounter me as the pastor and say, "I'm here to speak to the pastor." And I'll say, "Well, I'm the pastor. May I help you?" And he'll say, "You're the pastor?" And I say, "Yes, sir." And I happened to be pregnant at the time. And he said, "You're pregnant?" And I said, "Yeah." And he goes, "The pastor's pregnant. The world must be coming to an end." And then he proceeded to ask me for assistance. I have had people call me. I have had people display their sexism in describing my preaching. People have called me feisty. I've had people call me. I've had people say that if I raised my voice or showed a bit of frustration from the pulpit or even passion, that they have questioned me and said I was concerned you were going to get out of control. I have had people mansplain things to me more than I can possibly count. Yeah, it's everywhere, Hope. I'm sorry. How depressing. But yeah, absolutely.
Okay, despite the harsh stereotypes, would you say that your career as a pastor has more positive results than negative results?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. The joy of serving other people and sitting with people in their times of vulnerability is a great privilege and a rare gift. I love to preach. And I love to study scripture. I love to serve our community and be an advocate for justice and change. Yeah, I absolutely. The positives have outweighed the negatives. Yeah, but it's hard. And I'll say this too, Hope, in relationship to the interview. One of the big positives I see in ministry, and one of the reasons why it's outweighed the negatives, is I look back on women who came before me as examples for me and as a way to, they helped me expand my imagination of what women could do in ministry. And I hope that I am doing that for others the way it was done for me. I remember an opportunity where I was hanging out with a bunch of kids at a church event, and we were painting pottery, and somebody had brought a friend, this little girl, and she, we were talking, and she goes, "Now you're the pastor?" And I said, "I am." And she must have been in third grade, Hope. And she said, "I didn't know women could be pastors." I said, "They absolutely can." And it was a tiny little moment, right? But that might have been really significant for her. I mean, who knows? So even though it's really hard, it's hopeful. I'm hopeful about it.
Okay. Have you ever, going off my last question, was there ever any moment, even a tiny one, that you ever started to regret your decision to go into Christian missionary for any reason at all?
Yes. Do you want me to expand on that?
If you want, you don't have to.
Yeah. Yeah, I think ministry can just be very hard. Yeah. Yeah. And I think ministry can take a toll, and sometimes the toll of it, regret may be too strong of a word. Regret may be too strong of a word. I'd like to take that back. I don't think I've ever regretted it. I guess I guess sometimes I have wondered how much longer can I keep doing this? How much longer, can I endure certain things about it? But again, the positives outweigh the negatives. So yeah, sorry to kind of change my answer on you, but
All good.
yeah, I don't think I regret it. I think sometimes it's just hard, and in those moments, you kind of wonder, is this, is this it? Can I keep doing this kind of thing? Yeah.
So, do you remember any other severe type of harassment you related due to the negative stereotypes that does exist in your career?
This is a great question. I shared some of the stories already that I might consider harassment. The kissing on the cheek without asking permission. I mean, harassment's kind of it's kind of a strong word, and so I would say that I don't think I have. I don't. Yeah. I think I would just say I have a hard time answering that. I will say that I think in this past year, in particular, there have been moments of bullying or bad behavior that might be linked with sexist stereotypes of women overreacting. I have personally kind of wondered about that in relationship to how churches are responding to COVID. I think I have heard and have kind of noticed that a lot of women who are in ministry seem to be getting a lot more pushback on wearing masks and other things than their male counterparts. And so I've just kind of wondered, you talk about harassment. I've wondered about that, but I can't say that definitively. But it certainly made me wonder. Yeah.
Also, lastly, I just want to ask, what is one change you wish for the future for female stereotypes or for female faith leaders?
Mhm. This is going to sound odd, but I wish that one stereotype that could be changed is this automatic assumption that women are mothering and naturally caring and will do anything for you. And along with that goes kind of an over-functioning. It's okay for women to over-function because, I mean, gosh, women have to do it all. I think that that stereotype, why women, of course, can be caring and compassionate. I think that by restricting women into that natural assumption that that's who they are, especially in the pastoral role, you can overlook or diminish a lot of their gifts. Sometimes they're more prominent gifts.